Hello and welcome back to another episode of Vikings Happy Hour. And this week, our guest is Ben Goessling from the Star Tribune. Ben, thank you for joining us. Fresh off a Kevin O'Connell extension, the conference championship games are done. What is? I'm just going to dive right into it.
Yeah.
What is the vibe in TCO right now?
Well, I mean, I think there's a lot of excitement about the O'Connell extension. I mean, that was something that was going to happen fairly quickly after the season. And the fact that the Wilfs did it as quickly as they did shows you they weren't going to wait around with that. But now it's kind of this thing of getting back to work. I mean, Kevin O'Connell, I think, knows that this is a step. I mean, it's an endorsement, certainly, of what he's done in his first 3 years. But now the level of expectations go up. And this expectation of let's take the next step, let's win in the playoffs, let's be a contender, and I'm sure he's being compensated quite nicely for his services. So I think a lot of this is kind of setting that bar a little bit higher for him, and I think a lot of the work they're doing at this point is in response to that as they get going here.
Did we get Kevin O'Connell's contract numbers yet?
No, we haven't, and they've been pretty quiet about that. I think there's probably a few reasons for that, but sometimes with coaches we don't get those very easily, and I think especially as they are still in negotiations with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, there's I think a lot of things that they are trying to keep under wraps at this point. So I don't know when we will get those or if we will. Coaching contracts work a little bit differently than player contracts simply because there's not a union and there's not this desire for everybody to kind of know what's going on with everybody. So I don't even know how much it matters. I mean, we're all curious, but when there's no salary cap, there's not a competitive sort of reason for that stuff to be a huge issue. It's certainly something we want to know, and we'll keep trying to find that out. But it tends to work a little bit differently than the player contracts do. That's for sure.
You mentioned Kwesi's in contract negotiations right now. What's the status on that? Is there urgency to get that done? I mean, I know Kwesi, when you look at his tenure here, draft classes have kind of missed, free agent classes have hit. Jury's still out on last year's draft class, but like, where are the Wilfs right now with Kwesi and his contract extension?
Well, they're in talks about it, and I think that will get done here this offseason. I don't know that it will be quite as urgent. I think there's some things you got to figure out there. Obviously, his market probably looks a little bit different than Kevin O'Connell's did. There was certainly interest in Kevin O'Connell around the league. I mean, people knew that if Kevin O'Connell made it out of his contract, he was going to be a very hot target. And the Wilfs, I think, knew that as well. I think they have a lot of interest in getting a deal done with Kwesi Adofo-Mensah, but it's probably a little bit of a different timetable simply because there's not that same – I don't know that the Vikings were responding to the external pressure with Kevin O'Connell, but I think there was at least an understanding of, hey, from O'Connell's camp, we want to get this done, and we want to kind of know where you guys stand here fairly early in the process. And I think with Kwesi, it will get done. I don't think it'll be terribly far into the offseason because one of the things you have to do here is before these guys are making a quarterback decision, you do not want a general manager and a head coach on a different timetable. You don't want a general manager that is still saying, hey, I have to think about my immediate future here, and a head coach saying, let's think about the long term. I mean, that's sort of flipped from where you typically see those two jobs work together, where it's usually the GM that's thinking a little more long term. So I would think before we get too much further into the offseason, they'll want to get that done. So that's not an issue for anybody, and they're thinking only about what happens with the team and what's best for the team going into 2025.
Ben, as you kind of reported with the Kevin O'Connell news, that they actually got it done over the weekend.
Yeah.
And they just waited to announce it to avoid, having it get buried. And is it possible that we're going to get something similar with the Kwesi announcement sometime this week, or do you think it is still longer out into the future?
Well, I think it's a little bit of a different timetable. I mean, that one was division playoffs that weekend. It got done that weekend. And then the presidential inauguration was Monday. So some of the reason they held it until Tuesday, I think is when it actually went, was to stay out of the way of all of that news. Obviously, we're not getting another presidential inauguration, and we're a little bit in this dead period with the Super Bowl. So I don't think that'll be the same concern. I mean, there are times where teams want to stay. I mean, there's kind of this understanding in the NFL of don't make a ton of big news during the Super Bowl, but the Super Bowl is still a couple of weeks away. So I don't think there's going to be any type of that pressure or that kind of thinking in the process that we see with Kwesi, at least in the same way that it worked with Kevin.
Sure. Hey, you mentioned something a little bit earlier, which was, now the team is trying to figure out exactly what are the next steps to get over that hump, win the playoff game. Obviously, there's some glaring needs on the team. We don't have a secondary currently right now in contract, and we really struggled in the interior of that offensive line this year. In your opinion, or from what you're hearing around TCO, what is going to be that higher priority between that? And do you know if they have a plan or what the plan is to kind of rectify both of those situations?
Well, I mean, they've got money to spend. I think that's going to have to be some of it. Simply looking at the draft pick stockpile or lack thereof is probably a better way to put that with the draft picks. I do think there's going to be interest in spending money at guard, which is a big change. I mean, this is my 13th year covering this team. Andrew Kramer, I think, is a year behind me. And we were talking the other day about how many off seasons have the two of us covered on this beat where the guard position has not been an issue. And we were having a hard time. I think we went back to like maybe my first year on the beat was 2012. That was like when Brandon Fusco had his moments. Yes. And that group, Adrian Peterson got all of those guys paid because that was the MVP year for Adrian. And then, Lodeholt got paid. Fusco got paid. Jerome Felton basically anybody who had anything to do with Adrian Peterson got a contract. I mean, Adrian Peterson probably was doing a lot of that on his own too, but they paid everybody. So I think that was probably the last time that the guard position wasn't something of an issue, because then you had your kind of Alex Boone phase, your Andre Smith, your Josh Kleins. I mean, all of these draft picks that didn't pan out. I think there is going to be a different approach to that this year. I expect they're going to spend some money at guard, maybe two of those spots. I would think at least one that they'll probably go out and try to make a big splash there. I mean, Trey Smith's going to be the name that everybody's talking about at the top of the market if, in fact, he makes it out of Kansas City. So I think whether it's him or whether it's kind of somebody in that class, I do think there's more of a focus, more of an interest in spending money at that spot. Corner, we'll have to see how it goes. I mean, Byron Murphy, re-signing him, I think, will be something they're interested in doing. That won't be cheap. They had offered him an extension before last season, and he turned it down, kind of betting on himself, and he won that bet. He had a great year. I mean, 6 interceptions, going to his first Pro Bowl. He certainly has earned himself a market, so I think he will have one. I think they will have interest in bringing him back, but then you need more. I mean, do you go sign another veteran? Do you draft a guy high? Do you count on Mekhi Blackman coming back from the ACL to be that guy? I mean, I think they have high hopes for Mekhi Blackman, but the old Mike Zimmer phrase about the right number of corners being just one more is kind of true. So I think they will make that a priority as well. But the thing for them this year, and I'm sure we'll get into it with the quarterback discussion and the impact this has on the money as well. If they have all of their cash, if they don't have a lot of it going to Sam Darnold, they have plenty of money to spend, which is the first time we've been able to say that since maybe back, not quite back as far as those days of 2012, but they have been the expensive. Like that. Yeah. I mean, really, it was the Teddy Bridgewater injury that took them out of the days of cheap quarterback costs. I mean, it was Bradford right after that, and then it was Cousins, and then this year it's been not super expensive, but you had the dead money from Cousins. So it's been a long time since they have been out of that expensive quarterback world, and we'll see if they're going to be in that for one more year. But if they're not, they have money to spend on a lot of these things.
What's your sense on the Darnold situation? I know it's going to be a talker until it's resolved, but do you really think that they feel comfortable giving somebody 35, 40 million? And then, what does that do with JJ McCarthy? Does that, they kind of put their eggs in his basket?
Yeah, I mean, in the plan for a long time, the interest for a long time has been have these years now where you have the cheap quarterback, where that you kind of get that contract surplus of having a quarterback play at a high level if they can get him there, and then you're not paying big money for what that position is worth. So that has been something they've been very interested in for a number of years. I think it's part of the reason Kirk Cousins is no longer here, because they wanted to shift to that type of a model. Now, Kwesi talked about this when he did his season-ending press conference. He said he asked Kevin O'Connell, what type of information would you need to change your mind in terms of the level of quarterback play, where you'd say, well, maybe let's keep Sam Darnold around. I think it's going to be very interesting to watch how that market works out. They may have a read on it by the point where they have to make a decision on the franchise tag, which I think is March 5th.
Mm-hmm.
If they feel like Sam Darnold's not going to have a big enough market that we have to pay that type of money to get him back, then maybe they would say, let's work out a shorter deal. And, maybe it's $20 million a year or something like that. I think they would be interested in something like that. I don't know that the franchise tag is something they've ruled out either, because I think a lot of the reason to do the franchise tag would be to say, we have some control of the compensation if he does walk out the door. I mean, a lot of teams are going to look at those last 2 games the way all of us did and say, hey, that does not communicate championship level quarterback play. I think there's also going to be this question for other teams of how much of this with Sam Darnold was the fact that he had these pieces around him. He had Kevin O'Connell kind of mentoring him and walking him through the offense, helping him get up to speed with the offense. He had Josh McCown. He had Grant Udinski. He had Wes Phillips. I mean, all of these things that he had, he would not have somewhere else necessarily in the same way. Certainly won't have Justin Jefferson. So I think a lot of the valuation of Darnold will depend on how much people think he can repeat what he did this year without all of the advantages that he has in Minnesota. And if teams say, you know what, we don't think he can do it, maybe that creates a little bit of a backdoor for the Vikings to get Darnold back that way. I expect there'll probably be a team that wants a quarterback badly enough that he will find that suitor. I mean, just like Kirk Cousins did.
Yeah.
But I wonder if the Vikings will try to sift through this a little bit longer and say, maybe the franchise tag isn't the only way to get this done. Maybe you do sign him and to a contract that would still be very tradable. I think that's something they'll at least consider as we go through the next few weeks here.
Do you think that there'd be an interest from, obviously Darnold has talked a lot about wanting to come back and how much he loves it here, but if he could potentially go to another team and be the unquestioned potentially starter there rather than coming back and potentially competing with JJ McCarthy, I mean, it'd be an interesting concept from Darnold's perspective of whether or not he would even want to come back and be a part of that situation.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, a lot of the discussion for him is going to be, am I going to be the starter? Am I going to be kind of in the situation I was in last year where if JJ McCarthy's ready, at whatever point the Vikings determine that to be, I'm getting pushed to the side. I think last year he was in that spot in part because that was the best option he had. He's in a different spot now. He will probably have a little more of a market and a little more leverage to say, you know what? I don't love the idea that I'm still on this kind of short leash if that is in fact where it turned out to go. I wonder if there would be teams out there that may have a close enough situation that would be of interest to him. The 49ers, I don't think we're terribly excited to lose him. They're going to have an interesting decision to make with Brock Purdy. Matthew Stafford in LA, I wonder about. I mean, that would be home for Sam Darnold. That would be a similar system to the one he's in here. You have a lot of that advantage with a guy like Sean McVay working with you in a very similar fashion to what Kevin O'Connell would be. So if there are fits like that, I do wonder if he would say, hey, that's a better way for me to go. But the thing the Vikings have to know too is JJ McCarthy ready to take the job? They felt very good about the work he did, at least as much as he was able to do in that kind of redshirt year. He was around a lot. We saw him in the locker room a lot. He was in a lot of meetings. He was in practices. He was working with VR stuff. I mean, at the GoPro stuff on Darnold's helmet, we heard a lot about that. I had a couple of conversations with him. He was very big on how much that helped him just to kind of get that bird's eye view of what Darnold was seeing, what he was thinking as he's going through practices. So as much as you could do, I think he did. It's just going to be this question of, is he physically ready? I think the knee will be ready to go, but he has a lot to get back to now that he can be on a field. And I don't think he'll leave many stones unturned. He certainly does not seem like the type that will, but they have to say, I mean, moving on from Darnold in March would be saying we are comfortable with JJ McCarthy in every way that we have to be comfortable with him, or we have another option, whether it's Daniel Jones or another veteran quarterback that we feel okay about, kind of in that Darnold type role. So if you were keeping Darnold, it doesn't have to be forever. I mean, you could keep him and say, you know what, Maybe somebody comes through the draft and doesn't love their options, and we work out a trade at that point too. So I think, Kwesi talked about options. That was kind of the watchword from him, and I think a lot of this is going to be intended on having them continue to have those options as they go into the spring here, because you don't know completely on JJ McCarthy. I think they're confident in what he is, but when he's coming off that injury, having options is not a bad thing.
That's right. So recently, there's been a lot of talk. I know we talked a little bit about internal offensive line earlier in the talk. We talked about fixing the run game and what it kind of is why have the Vikings struggled so much because in the run game? Is it just because the interior offensive line? Is it scheme? Is it running back? And then also Aaron Jones has been very vocal, or at least he was, about being interested in coming back with the Vikings again next year. Is that something that you think is on the table for the Vikings to bring him back, or what do they do at the running back position?
Yeah, that's going to be an interesting one. I think it'd be on the table with Jones. I think a lot of this is going to come down to what's the price. What does he want? What are they willing to do? He's going to be 31 years old, I think, in December. So that's not a great place for a running back market. I think he showed he's still got quite a bit left, but they could use, I think, another guy at that spot who's a little more dynamic. Jones showed a lot throughout the year, especially early in the year. He was playing through some things towards the end of the season that probably impacted his explosiveness a little bit. But if they could find, if he becomes it's not quite the same, but if he becomes your David Montgomery type, can you find, not that you're going to get Jahmyr Gibbs right away, but if you find somebody that gives you that type of a jolt, I think there would be interest in that. I mean, they've talked a lot about efficiency, and they've done better in that regard. And also, if you're better in the interior offensive line, I don't think it's just pass protection. They have had a lot of carries where running backs are getting hit at or near the line of scrimmage. In fact, I think we pulled some stats in a couple of stories towards the end of the season from Sports Info Solutions that was like 72% of their runs, they were getting hit within a yard of the line of scrimmage or something like that. So there is more they can do to help whoever it is carrying the ball, whether it's Aaron Jones or Cam Akers or Ty Chandler or somebody else on the offensive line front. But I do think that's a spot where if it's a third-round pick or something like that in the middle of the draft, if they trade back and maybe get a couple more late day 2, early day 3 picks, I think a running back there would make a lot of sense, because I think that's a spot you're going to have to look at in the not too distant future. Even if it is Aaron Jones, it's not going to be Aaron Jones for the next 3 years. So getting a back on a rookie contract with fresh legs, I think, makes a lot of sense.
I have a question for you about the draft. Sorry, Ryan, you can go after this. But last year we saw Kwesi make a move pre-draft. To secure some extra draft capital. Knowing that they have limited draft capital, do you see a situation playing out where maybe they do something like that again? Or how are they going to go about? I mean, I know they have cash to address things in free agency, but that's not always the best way to go about things from a process standpoint. So how do they go about filling the voids through the draft with such limited capital?
So you're asking, would they trade up or would they trade back?
Trade back, or just use extra picks from 26.
Sure,
maybe a day 2 pick, day 3, whatever that.
I got you. I could see them certainly trading back to try to get a couple more things in that third round kind of range. Trading back from 24, what are you going to get of major value? I don't know that you're going to do a ton of work there to get top 100 picks. I think that's going to be a hard thing to do.
Sure.
But would they move some of those 2026 picks? Yeah, I could see something like that, because they still have that full complement of picks. And if they lose Sam Darnold, and we're going to have a lot of these things to figure out with comp picks going forward. But if they lose Sam Darnold, they will get a comp for that. If they lose a guy like if Brian Flores leaves to become a head coach at some point, they would get picks for that. I have to refresh my memory on how it would work if Durante Jones gets a coordinator job somewhere else. I think it's a head coaching job that you have to get. It's not the head coaching thing. Yeah. So Flores would be really kind of the option there. That isn't going to happen this year, but it could in a year, I think. So there's some of those things that could add to their draft stockpile going forward, and they should have all of their picks in 2026. So yeah, I wouldn't be shocked if they said, let's throw a fourth in next year and then trade back or something, or kind of take your third and pair it with a fourth next year to move up. I could see some things like that where they are not standing pat in this year's draft. Let's put it that way. I mean, they have 4 picks. If you count that comp third with Cousins, I think they are going to have to do some things to fill things out because they only have 38 players under contract, and you can hit in free agency like they did, but do you want to live that way every year?
Right.
Do you want to assume you're right that much? Do you want to be signing guys to 1-year contracts that you have to replace every year when you don't have the draft picks? I think there is going to be an effort to try to replenish draft picks to some degree. I would not be surprised at all if, whether it's before the draft or during the draft, they are trying to get a few more swings at it. I mean, the top 100 picks are what Kwesi wants, more so than the Rick Spielman approach of they're all lottery tickets of equal value, and the more swings you get, the more chances you have. Kwesi doesn't look at it that way. There's a weighting to these things in terms of what the value is. But I think even if you get a few more chances at it, it does allow you maybe to package some of those picks and move up if you want to be able to do it when you get to the draft. So I think they'll be active as much as they can in that regard.
Sweet.
And do you think that their thought process, or going back to the Darnold bit here, their thought process about Darnold, even if they are comfortable with JJ McCarthy and still decide to franchise tag him in the hopes that they would be able to then trade that contract to a team who then can pay him whatever he may want, or whatever they can come to an agreement to? One, is that a possibility you think the Vikings are looking at? And two, would that be something that would need to almost be like pre-negotiated, like these backroom talks at the, at whatever event, Senior Bowl, Combine, or whatever, to kind of have that in place before making the decision?
Well, I don't know how much the backroom stuff will play into that. It certainly could. I mean, you get a lot of these things where when it's a tag and trade, that stuff is, you have to know that there's going to be a market for that, because if your intention is to trade him and you don't want to keep him on your roster at that number, it helps to know that there is going to be some of that market out there for you to work off of. So I'm sure that'll get discussed. I think the possibility of, whether it's negotiated that far in advance or whether it's something that as they move towards free agency or even move into that, period after free agency, I certainly think it's an option they'd consider. I think the possibility of trading him to ensure that you get more than you would in a year if he leaves in free agency and you're talking comp picks is very much something they're interested in doing. The other thing with comp picks for next year to consider is if they go out and spend a bunch of money this spring, it doesn't leave them in a great position to get comp picks, because all of this stuff gets calculated on a ledger and you get paid, you get compensated for the net of what you lost. So they could go out and spend a bunch of money in free agency on contracts that either cancel out, Sam Darnold, or cancel out some of the other picks they would get. So it nets out that, hey, a third in a year is all you're going to get for the overall class of free agents from this year that you lose compared to what you gain. They may say, we want something bigger than that, or we want something sooner than that, especially in a year where we don't have very many draft picks. So I do think keeping Darnold past March 12th is something that would make some sense, because it does give you that flexibility to talk to teams further into the spring. This is not thought at this point to be a great quarterback draft. And obviously that comes down to, does anybody fall in love with anybody in the draft, whether or not we look at the class as saying, hey, this is a great class or not. That dictates a lot of what the market would be for a trade. But if they're sitting there saying there may be a team that doesn't love these quarterbacks and says, Sam Darnold's only 27 years old, we saw what he did this year, we can work with that, and he'll continue to get better as he gets more time as a starter, I don't think it's a bad thing to have that option past March 12th. I think that would make a lot of sense to retain that, lever that you could pull sometime between March 12th and April 25th, April 26th, when the draft starts. I certainly think it's something they take a look at.
Sure.
I guess my only question about that would be, how much would that impact depending upon what kind of contract you're looking at for Darnold, how much would that impact their ability to plan effectively about how to structure contracts or who they need to bring in? in free agency. So, having that flexibility is I guess on both ends is something Kwesi would have to weigh to figure out, do we hold on to this asset in Darnold all the way till April, hoping someone bites?
Yeah.
But then if a market doesn't materialize, did you just, restrict your ability to have to fix the roster as much as you'd like, come back in March? So it will be really fascinating to see how they play that and how much they are determined to get an asset out of Darnold.
Yeah, I think that is going to be a lot of the trade-off here, because if they don't bring him back, it is, you can go nuts in free agency. You can kind of do whatever you want. They will still have plenty of money to spend even with him back. But when they have the number of needs that they do, I think that is going to be something they would need to balance out and consider. I think a couple of things that come to mind there. Number one, we've seen Rob Brzezinski work a lot of magic over the years with the cap. He's extremely good at what he does. He's been excellent at keeping them in relatively healthy cap straits over the years. They're not one of these teams that's living in constant cap jail like we see with the Saints over the years. I think they've done a good job of managing things as best they can. So there's that. And then I think even if you were to tag Darnold, it's not one of these things where you have all of these years of cap costs going forward. I mean, obviously Jefferson's number is going to go up. You're going to have the Darisaw numbers go up. You're going to have Hawkinson, although he's probably going to get a restructure here at some point, I would guess. Those things are going to be there, but a lot of this, too, is the cap keeps going up. I mean, these TV contracts continue to bump the cap just about every year. So if they were to say, we don't have our full complement of 2025 money, at least until Sam Darnold is on somebody else's roster, if they were to play it that way, I could see them saying, let's backload a few of these deals, or let's stick the void years in there, which they have shown willingness to do, because a lot of their thought process on that is this is an interest-free loan. If the cap keeps going up and we're borrowing money from the future, it's basically we're borrowing money that's going to be like couch cushion change, I should say, in a few years anyway. So I think that would be that. I think they would have some maneuvers to make to get a lot of what they want, and then still be able to keep Sam Darnold even for the short term. I wouldn't look at that as a binary. I think they would have enough options to do that and retain some leverage there if they wanted to trade him, in April or whatever it would happen to be, and then also say we can get done a lot of what we want to get done in free agency.
If the Vikings were to keep Darnold on the franchise tag, do you think that would lock him in as the 2025 starter, or do you think that they'd be open to having a $40 million backup on their team?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess we've seen. I don't think they would want to do that. I can think of a $40 million backup, and there's some connection to this market in the last year or so. I don't think it's what anybody prefers to do, but if they wanted that option, if they wanted that time to say, let's develop a market, let's hold on to him to build a market, and let's have a little more time to look at JJ McCarthy. It's not ideal. It certainly would not be what you'd prefer to do, but I think if they did it, they'd go in with their eyes open to all of that. I do think one thing with this front office is they very rarely are thinking about things that they haven't considered the side effects of. I think Kwesi is somebody that, when he talks a lot about, Monte Carlo simulations are something that have come up, and he takes some grief for those things. But basically what he's saying is, I'm accounting for the fact that Sam Darnold may be here, Sam Darnold may be here, Sam Darnold may be way down here, and all of these things are possibilities. So I think any scenario where this could work out in some way or another, in terms of there is no market for Darnold, we're stuck with this, that will be something they've thought through pretty thoroughly. And I think anything they do, they go in with their eyes pretty open to that possibility of, maybe we don't get a market for him, and maybe we do have a $40 million backup for a year. I think any of those scenarios, if they make a move, they will have thought through those things beforehand and been comfortable enough with them to say, we're going to do this come what may, and we'll live with the consequences of it.
Sweet. I have one more question for you, Ryan. I just want to make sure that you got everything you want answer.
Yeah, I got one more too, and maybe
Yeah,
it's the
fire
same
away.
topic, so I'm not sure. But
Why don't you go and then I'll wrap it.
sure. So you've seen some of the impact that these defensive lines have been making. Obviously,
Yeah.
the last two games that we played, that's what ruined us,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
And even watching the Bills game, right, Bills
Yeah.
Chiefs game, seeing the impact Chris Jones had on those QB sneaks and everything like that.
Yeah.
It's a big need. Obviously, we went and exercised our opportunity to re-sign Jalen Redmond. Which obviously that was a nice surprise mid-year that came along. But obviously that D-line, interior D-line, I should say, is still far from a finished product here. Two-part question, I guess, is with the draft being this deep at that position, do we want to go and spend big money at that position, or do you think that there's a guy like Milton Williams, or I don't know how to say Osa's last name, but the Osa from the Cowboys, guys like that where they're maybe going to command $15-18 million a year? Is that a route that they'd maybe rather go to get that established guy that they know can be effective? Do you have any sense in the building on what they're thinking there?
Not quite yet. I mean, I think in general, if it's a position in the draft where you feel like there's a decent stockpile of talent here and there's guys that they like in their system, because I mean, that's the other piece of this is that Brian Flores looking like he's still going to be here. I think that is a benefit to the Vikings in this time of year, especially because we saw it last year where he said, I want this guy to play this role in my system, and here's how he's going to fit. He's been a scout. He's been a coach. He knows how to kind of bridge the gap in how scouts talk and how coaches talk. So I think a lot of this will be determined, I should say, by what Brian Flores says this would be really helpful for us. I think, they were interested in Christian Wilkins last year. So I think there is an appetite to make a difference at that position. Find somebody who's going to be disruptive in the middle of that defensive line. That's been a need for a while. I think it's been, you could take that back. The last time they really invested in that position was Sharif Floyd in 2013. And then the next year, they liked Aaron Donald. They didn't take him because they also liked Anthony Barr for Mike Zimmer's defense. And then I think they figured we have Sharif Floyd too. So it has been that long since they made a major investment in the middle of the defensive line. So whether it's in free agency or whether it's a first-round pick, I think they're aware that that's a need as well. So in a draft where there is talent there, you can certainly go that way and say, well, let's get somebody that's going to come in and be an immediate impact on the defensive line. But a couple of things come to mind there. They only have the one pick in the first two rounds. So a deep draft, may leave somebody there for you in the third round, but it's not like they have multiple swings at it in the first two rounds. And then the other piece of this is we saw with Dallas Turner. Rookies don't always play a lot in a Brian Flores defense. Ivan Pace did. Certainly Turner got more of a role towards the end of this season, but you have to earn that in this defense. You have to show you can handle all of the checks, all of the communication that they put on everybody to either relay the signals or know what it means for them. So I do think there's some level of emphasis on experience. And if they say, hey, that's better acquired in free agency, which obviously it would be, then we'll spend the money to do it. I don't think that would be out of the question at all. Because I do think it's a need. I think we see the impact on it from other teams. I think they deal with it in terms of, we talk about interior pressure on these guards. They face a lot of that where teams can exploit their weaknesses there. And having another set of reinforcements in that part of things, I think is a valuable investment as well.
Sweet. My last question here, and you kind of alluded to it, but I feel like there's got to be some people surprised in TCO that Brian Flores is sticking around and didn't get a head coaching job, and which can benefit us, right? The two people I want to talk to you about are Cam Bynum, obviously an impending free agent, and has said he wants to come back if the money's right, and that's the typical phrase I feel like we always hear from the free agents, which is fine. And then the other one is Harrison Smith, who was clearly emotional after that playoff loss. And is there any status update on, whether he's coming back? Obviously he's not under contract, but does he want to play another year? Does the Flores thing play an impact with either of those two? coming back to the Vikings?
Well, certainly for Harrison Smith, I think that does have an impact. I mean, a lot of why he wanted to come back for 2024 was to work with Brian Flores again. He talked about how much fun it was playing in this defense. And those two have, I think, developed quite a relationship in terms of just throwing things out there in terms of scheme or different ideas. I mean, Flores has said that Harrison Smith is sometimes the one to say, hey, that's probably a little too aggressive. It's a little too crazy. But I think Harrison is enough of a gadfly that he enjoys that back and forth with Flores and just kind of thinking about things differently. I think for him, it's going to come down to health. He was banged up at the end of the season, as a lot of guys are by the end of the year, but played a lot of football over the last 13 years. I mean, a lot of years of 1,000 snaps, a lot of years where he's playing through things, not a guy that missed very many games. He's also got 2 young kids at home. So I think that is going to be a lot of his thought process here too. I wouldn't be surprised if this is it for him. Just thinking about being home with his kids and with his wife and what that may look like for the next stage of his life. I think all of those things are very much going to weigh in his thought process. So I wouldn't be surprised if he said, it's been a great run, but I'm going to move on from here after this season. I think if he plays again, it'll be here. I certainly think he's not looking to do anything new at this point. He's comfortable here. He enjoys what he has, enjoys the people he works with. It won't be something that will kind of be this widespread free agency search. And I don't think that's going to be a factor for him. But I think the bigger question will be his health and just what he wants to do. I think he'll be 36 here in a couple of weeks, which is hard to believe.
Yeah.
It's the last guy on the roster that's been here as long as I have. So that one's going to be weird for me whenever he hangs it up. But it happens. It happens for everybody. So it'll be a strange one for me when he's finally gone. And enjoyed covering him and walking over to his locker to chit chat with him on Fridays has been a highlight for me for a long time. So that one's gonna hit me a little different. But I think it's very possible that he makes the decision to say let's hang it up and just kind of move on while I still have relatively good health and kind of spend time with my family from there. But as far as Cam Bynum goes, that is going to be, I think, a very interesting one to watch. I think there's interest in bringing him back, but it'll depend a lot on the market because Josh Metellus, I think, has already outplayed that contract. I mean, he's already hitting incentives that very clearly the Vikings were not intending for him to hit. You don't do contracts in a way that shell out multiple millions of dollars of incentives every year if you are expecting a player to be at a certain level. He certainly has gone beyond what they thought was going to happen. And I think he'll get compensated as a result of that. Now, do you want Josh Metellus as your deep safety if Cam Bynum's not here and Harrison Smith is not here? I don't know that they would see him that way. I mean, certainly he's been better as this chess piece type. Theo Jackson maybe comes in and is a bigger factor in that group if both Harrison Smith and Cam Bynum are gone and you still want to use Metellus that way. But if Bynum can be brought back at a reasonable price, I think there's a lot of interest in doing that. I mean, we saw some things with him in coverage where he'd get beat. We saw some things open field tackling where he would struggle. But he certainly has had a penchant for the ball, certainly knows how to make plays as we see, because we see all the celebrations after a lot of those.
Yes.
There were a lot of dances because there were a lot of plays that he made. So there is that part of it. And obviously a guy that has played a lot. He's been extremely durable and has been one of those people that's part of that kind of hub of communication that Brian Flores talks about. So I think it'll depend a lot on price there. If they feel like they can get something done in a reasonable amount with him and he says, I want to continue to be here, I think there'd be interest in that. But it'll probably come down to that because they have enough other expensive needs, whether it's the guards, whether it's the corner. We talk about an interior defensive lineman. I think you could make an argument for a number of different places that are going to demand some money. So is safety the place that you want to do it, especially if you're going to give Metellus a new deal? Yeah. I don't know. So I think some of that will depend on, is there a level playing field, so to speak, or at least a range for that discussion for Bynum to come back? If there is, I think there'd be interest, but it'll come down to a lot of that stuff.
It is going to be a chaotic offseason.
Yes,
and it's just getting started. The Senior Bowl is this week. So they're going to get a good look at some prospects. Ben, I want to thank you for hopping on. We'll have to have you back in March as things maybe ramp up or ramp down. We'll see what happens, right?
Yeah, I mean that time of year when I can put my I have a 20-year-old accounting degree that I don't use for much else other than salary cap wonkiness. So
perfect.
March is kind of my time of year. So
yes,
yeah, happy to jump in and talk void years and signing bonus prorations and
I love it.
All of that stuff is far to my heart's content. So yeah, you guys know where to find me. Let's make that happen.
Also, I have to give you kudos. Your office setup is brilliant. Mine's a work in progress, if you can't tell, but yours is good. I like it.
Yeah, this is brand new. We just did this. This was kind of the big project. The garage, Minneapolis detached garage, needed to build a new one. It was kind of on the list of things to do when we moved in 12, 13 years ago. And so we said, well, if we're going to knock one down, let's put office space above it. So this is the above the garage office space, which has been kind of nice. So yeah, we're still kind of decorating some things back here, but yeah, the Star Tribune printouts behind me are kind of a fun thing. So I'll probably try to keep collecting a few of those. But yeah, it's probably need some new ones from this year, in fact. But yeah, it's been a fun thing to set up. So yeah, we'll continue to work at it here.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for everyone listening. Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe, and we'll be back with more content later this week. Arif Hassan will join us live from the Senior Bowl. So we'll get a breakdown of kind of what prospects are standing out down there. So until next time, everybody, Skol Vikings.